Hey everybody, so now we're going to go and move on to another aspect related to higher order cognition, intelligence. And so when we talk about intelligence, it's very, very important to understand what we mean. So it's very, very easy when we talk about somebody who we think is intelligent to think of somebody who is very learned, very educated, very adaptable, and we'd probably call them smart. And so it's really easy to think of intelligence as being something like book smart. And maybe certain aspects of that are intelligent behavior, but it turns out that psychologists actually will define intelligence a bit more broadly than how the average person will think of intelligence. Intelligence is your ability to learn from experience, solve problems, and use knowledge to help you adapt to new situations. And that can be tied in with creativity. And so learning from experience is what's helped keep our species alive. If we discovered that sticking our finger in an electrical socket hurts and we learn from that, that's going to keep us alive. And that is what we would consider intelligent behavior. So if you're learning from your mistakes, if you're trying to improve, if you're taking the things that you're learning and actually applying them to new situations to help you learn, we would say that you're pretty intelligent. Now, one of the biggest controversies in intelligence research is intelligence a general ability, or can there be multiple abilities involved in intelligence? So the first person to really talk about intelligence as an ability is Charles Spearman. And Charles Spearman proposed that general intelligence, or what he referred to as a G factor, is underlying performance on various tasks. So the general rule, part of the reason that he noted this is because he found that people who tend to have really outstanding intellectual abilities, if they score high in one area, like verbal ability, they're probably going to score high in other areas as well, like reasoning ability or comprehension ability or things like that. So what's actually kind of interesting, and you may not necessarily be aware of this, how did Spearman figure this out? Spearman actually figured this out by doing what's referred to as a factor analysis. So a factor analysis is when we take different types of tasks and we kind of sort them into clusters based on certain things. So for example, if you go to the grocery store, here's a really simple factor analysis that you do all the time. So let's say I've got a list like grapes, butter, cheese, apples, and ice cream. So I could take all of those different things and I could put them or sort them into larger groups, like one called fruit and one called dairy products. That is actually a very informal factor analysis that we do. So Spearman actually did this looking at intelligence by giving people a lot of different tasks that don't really look like they fit each other at all. So there were word problems, there were reasoning problems, there were, I'm going to give you a picture, you make up a story about it. There were memory problems and things like that. These are seemingly unconnected tasks. But one of the things that Spearman found is that when you look at how people perform on these tasks, you can pull out a common factor that's common to all of them. And this factor is G. So if you're high in G, you're probably going to do pretty well on all of those different tasks. If you're low in G, you're generally going to do worse on these different tasks. And Spearman really thought of mental abilities being like physical abilities in some aspect. Generally speaking, if you're a pretty fast runner, odds are pretty good you're going to throw a ball pretty well. I don't run fast or throw a ball well. And so because of that, that's one example of how these things kind of hang together. Now, not everybody agrees. So again, G is when those who score high in one area tend to score higher than average in other areas. They may not be perfect at everything, but they tend to be better than average. But there are different types of smart out there. At least that's what was theorized by Howard Gardner. The idea that intelligence tends to come in multiple forms. And so he proposed that there are actually 8 different types of intelligence, which you can actually see listed here. So there are people who are good with words. There are people who are good in nature. There are people who are really good at art and painting pictures. There are people who recognize and are able to move their bodies appropriately in space. So if you're a good dancer or a good athlete, you probably have high bodily kinesthetic intelligence. There are people who are musically gifted. There are people who have a lot of people smarts. Occasionally, we call these street smarts. And then we also have intrapersonal intelligence, or what we would call self-smarts. Now, it's these latter two, people smarts and self smarts, that actually make up another type of intelligence. Gardner didn't mention this type of intelligence, but it's one that's been proposed by several researchers, known as emotional intelligence. And that's when you're capable of perceiving emotions, understanding emotions in both yourself and others, managing emotions in both yourself and others, and using emotions to help you adapt. But part of the reason that Gardner thought that there were so many different intelligences is because he often found that people who have brain damage, you might have somebody who is brain damaged who was a very gifted composer, and the brain damage would severely damage their intellectual capabilities, but it didn't really hurt their ability to compose. Likewise, there are people who are known as savants. The term we used to use is idiot savant. It's far more appropriate to just call it savant syndrome. These people have severe intellectual impairments, but they're still gifted in a particular domain. So somebody who's severely intellectually impaired, your book talks about a case like Kim Peek, who had severe intellectual deficits, but was capable of really working with numbers in a way that the G factor certainly would not predict. So it has been suggested that there might be different types of smarts out there. Now, unfortunately, as nice as this idea is, a lot of the research that has been done looking at these different theories of intelligence actually tend to throw their support behind the G factor. And it predicts performance across a wide variety of different types of tasks, and your intelligence test scores, particularly those that measure G, do come into play and do very strongly predict your future performance. So as nice as this idea is, it's not necessarily backed up by research. However, emotional intelligence is probably pretty important, and there are researchers out there who actually say that it might be more important than the analytical intelligence that we typically talk about. So what is intelligence? Well, when we talk about research studies, we often define intelligence as whatever the intelligence test itself measures. And in particular, that's going to be usually what we refer to as book smarts. One of the things that we will talk about in the next section is that the intelligence test is also probably going to value what a privileged culture values. So one of the things that we're going to step into in the next section is that in general, groups that have a little bit more privilege across cultures tend to do much better on intelligence tests than groups that have been historically oppressed. And we'll talk about what that means later. But before we move on, I do want to talk about how intelligence tests work and how they were originally developed. So we're going to go over to France, and we are going to talk about the work of Alfred Binet. So Alfred Binet developed an intelligence test as a diagnostic tool. So in Binet's time, public schools were becoming quite common in France. Prior to the formation of public schools, schools were usually only for the wealthy, or the people that had the ability to send their children to school. Most people who were poorer or who worked on farms usually did not send their kids to school, A, because they didn't have the money, and B, those children were far more valued for the help that they could provide on the farm. And so all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you've got this flood of children who are going to school for the very first time, and you have no idea what their intellectual capabilities are. And so Binet developed a test to kind of figure out where people were, to assess where they needed to be placed and what their intellectual needs were. And so he developed the concept of something called a mental age. So you have a chronological age, the age you actually are, and then you have the mental age, which is what your intelligence is operating at. So if you were very gifted, your mental age was much higher than your chronological age. If you were on par with your age group, your mental age would match your chronological age. And then finally, if you had intellectual disabilities or deficits of any kind, your mental age was going to be less than your chronological age. And what's kind of interesting is that contrary to how we tend to view intelligence, we tend to treat it as a fixed quantity, something you either have or you don't, you're smart or you're not. Binet actually believed that intelligence could be increased through education. That's not something we tend to talk about much these days. So here are examples of different types of items that Binet would include on his tests. So at the age of 5, you were expected to be able to copy a square with pen and ink, indicate which of 2 cubes were heavier, and count up to 4 pennies. By the age of 7, the tasks get a little bit more complex. You're going to copy a diamond with pen and ink, and you're going to count 13 pennies. By the age of 9, you should be able to add and subtract well enough to make change in a fake transaction and arrange blocks in a certain order. And so how Binet calculated IQ was taking mental age over chronological age and multiplying by 100. So if you were on par with what your chronological age was, your IQ would be set at 100. So the average was set at 100. If you were advanced, your IQ would be over 100. And if you had intellectual disabilities, your IQ would be under 100. Now, as you're probably going to notice, this works really well with kids. This does not work very well with adults, because how would we determine the difference between what an 18-year-old should know and what a 40-year-old should know? And because of that, when we're calculating IQ in adults, we actually have to do something a little bit different. We're going to talk about this in a few slides. It's called standardization. Here is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. This is the IQ test that we usually tend to give to adults. It's referred to as the WAIS. There are also IQ tests for children. One is known as the WISC, and if you're in preschool or kindergarten, we actually have one called the WIPSI. But you can see that we're kind of basing IQ similar to how Spearman conceived of it. Give people a bunch of random tasks and see what things are correlated with each other. So there are 3 different IQ scores you get. You get an overall IQ score, you get a verbal IQ score, and a performance IQ score. So for verbal, you're getting things like general knowledge. I was once asked as a kid what animal hamburger comes from. Kindergarten me said ham. Similarities, math reasoning, vocab, comprehension, digit span, which is a short-term memory task. For performance IQ, we're going to get things that have more of a spatial component, so picture completion, picture arrangement, block design, object assembly, digit symbol substitution, and matrices, which are visual puzzles. So this is where I'm going to leave off. We'll talk more about how we do IQ today relative to how Binet did it in the past with children.